The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the parched Nebraska prairie as Katherine O'Sullivan slammed the door of her humble farmhouse, the hinges groaning in protest. She'd buried her husband just 3 weeks prior, leaving her alone with 100 acres of wheat that wouldn't harvest itself and a mortgage payment due before the first snow. In her 24 years of life, she'd never felt so utterly abandoned by both God and man. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving prairie showed no mercy to a woman on her own. Katherine's auburn hair whipped across her face as she trudged toward the fields, her calloused hands clutching the worn handle of a rusted plow. The soil had hardened under the relentless summer sun, mocking her desperate attempts to break ground for the winter wheat that might save her farm if she could somehow manage to plant it alone. For hours, Katherine strained against the stubborn earth, her muscles screaming in protest until finally, as the setting sun painted the sky in violent streaks of crimson, the plow handle slipped from her blistered hands. She collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing with sobs that had been building since the fever had taken James 3 weeks earlier. "I can't do this alone anymore," she wept in the fields, her tears darkening the dust beneath her. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered through her despair. A shadow fell across her trembling form, and Katherine looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the dying light. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. She hastily wiped her tears, embarrassment flooding her cheeks even as desperation kept her rooted to the spot. "Madam," he said simply, touching the brim of his weather-beaten hat. His voice was deep, carrying the rough texture of someone who spoke rarely but meant what he said. "Looks like you're having a hard time of it." Katherine straightened her spine, determined to salvage some dignity. "I'm managing just fine." The stranger's lips twitched slightly as he surveyed the barely scratched field. Without another word, he removed his worn leather coat, revealing broad shoulders beneath a faded blue shirt. He approached the abandoned plow, running a hand thoughtfully along its frame. "Name's Ethan Quinn," he said, rolling up his sleeves to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. "Passing through to Omaha when I saw you fighting with this old thing." With practiced ease, he positioned himself behind the plow and adjusted the blade. "Mind if I lend a hand?" Before Katherine could respond, he had taken hold of the handles, and with a strength that made her previous efforts seem pitiful, began to drive the plow through the resistant earth, cutting a clean, straight furrow. He worked steadily, the muscles in his back and shoulders flexing beneath his shirt as sweat began to darken the fabric. After cutting several rows, he paused, his breathing only slightly labored, and turned to face her. "Now we can," he said simply, gesturing to the freshly turned soil. "Together." Katherine stared at the stranger, this Ethan Quinn, her pride warring with her desperate need for help. Something in his steady gaze, neither pitying nor demanding, made her decision for her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words nearly lost in the evening breeze. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Katherine found herself walking beside Ethan Quinn toward her small farmhouse, explaining how she'd come to be alone with 100 acres and a plow she could barely move. "James and I came out from Pennsylvania 4 years ago," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "We'd been married just 6 months when the railroad offered cheap land to settlers willing to farm along the new line. James was so certain we'd make our fortune out here." She laughed bitterly. 4 years of drought, grasshoppers, and now fever, some fortune. Ethan listened silently, his face revealing nothing as they reached the porch steps. In the fading light, Katherine could better see his features, a strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a scar that ran from his right temple to his cheekbone. "I've got stew on the stove," she offered, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd spoken to another human being. "Not much, but you're welcome to share it. Least I can do." Ethan nodded, removing his hat as he followed her inside the modest one-room structure. "Much obliged, Mrs. O'Sullivan." "Katherine," she corrected, suddenly uncomfortable with the formality. "Or Kate, if you prefer." "Kate," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice, As Katherine ladled the simple stew into cracked bowls, she studied her unexpected guest covertly. He moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to sizing up his surroundings, his eyes taking in the sparse furnishings, the mended curtains, the small stack of books beside the bed. "You're not from these parts," she observed, placing a bowl before him. Ethan accepted the food with a nod of thanks. Texas originally, been moving north the past few years. Running from something? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and Katherine immediately flushed. "I'm sorry, that was terribly forward." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe, or toward something. Haven't figured that out yet." He took a spoonful of stew. "This is good." They ate in companionable silence until Katherine gathered her courage to ask the question weighing on her mind. "Mr. Quinn, Ethan," he corrected. "Ethan," she amended. "I appreciate your help today, truly I do, but I can't pay you anything substantial and there's still so much to be done before winter." She twisted her hands in her lap. "Why would you stop to help a stranger?" Ethan set down his spoon, considering his words carefully. "My pa used to say a man who won't help his neighbor ain't worth the ground he walks on. Don't matter if that neighbor's a stranger," he shrugged. "Besides, looks like you need the help and I've got nowhere pressing to be, so you'd stay to help with the planting." Hope fluttered dangerously in Katherine's chest. "If you'll have me, could bed down in the barn, earn my keep until the crop's in." His eyes met hers steadily. "No strings attached, Kate, just one neighbor helping another." Katherine's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "I'd be grateful," she managed. "Truly grateful." That night, after Ethan had retired to the barn with a lantern and blanket, Katherine lay awake in her empty bed, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of the house settling. For the first time since James had drawn his last breath, she felt something other than crushing despair. It wasn't hope, not quite yet, but perhaps its distant cousin possibility. Morning arrived with a blaze of golden light across the prairie. Katherine rose early, as was her habit, to find Ethan already at work in the field. He'd repaired the loose joint in the plow handle and was systematically turning the soil with a strength and efficiency that would have taken her weeks to match. She watched him for a moment, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer, before heading to the chicken coop to collect eggs for breakfast. By the time Ethan returned to the house, sweat-soaked and dusty, Katherine had hot coffee and a plate of eggs and cornbread waiting. "You didn't have to feed me," he said, washing his hands in the basin by the door. "We both need to eat," she replied practically. "And if you're going to work my land, you'll do it on a full stomach." They settled into a routine over the next few days. Ethan worked the fields from dawn until dusk, breaking only for the meals Katherine prepared. She tended the vegetable garden, mended fences, and cared for the few animals that remained after she'd sold most of the livestock to pay for James's doctor and burial. On the fourth evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass, Katherine finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "What were you before? Before you started heading north?" Ethan was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. "Was a cowhand mostly, drove cattle up from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, did some scouting for the army during the war." He paused. "Tried my hand at ranching for a spell, but it didn't take." "What happened?" Katherine asked softly. Ethan's fingers absently traced the scar on his face. "Drought, same as hit you folks, lost everything in '74, been drifting since." Katherine nodded, understanding all too well how quickly fortunes could change on the frontier. "And Omaha, what's waiting for you there?" "Nothing certain, heard the railroad's hiring, figured I'd try my luck." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the growing darkness. "What about you, Kate? What keeps you fighting for this place?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted since James had announced they were heading west to claim their fortune. She'd simply followed, as a good wife should, and then worked herself to the bone trying to make his dream come true. "I don't know," she admitted. "At first it was for James. He loved this land, saw something in it I never could, after he died." She trailed off, searching for words. "I suppose I stayed because leaving seemed harder than trying to make it work. Nowhere else to go, really." "Family back east," Katherine shook her head, Parents died when I was 16. No siblings, she smiled ruefully. James was all I had. Ethan nodded, understanding in his silence. They sat together as darkness claimed the prairie, each lost in their own thoughts but somehow less alone than they had been before. The days stretched into weeks as they worked side by side to prepare the fields and plant the winter wheat that might save Catherine's farm. Ethan taught her how to properly harness the plow horse to maximize its strength, showed her more efficient ways to irrigate the fields, and repaired the leaking roof before the autumn rains began. Katherine found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the careful precision of his movements, the rare smile that transformed his weathered face, the gentleness with which he treated her elderly mare. She told herself it was simply appreciation for his help, nothing more. She was a widow not yet 4 months, after all. But sometimes, when their hands accidentally touched over the dinner table, or when she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, Katherine felt something stir within her that she thought had died with James. October brought the first frost, crystallizing the prairie grass and painting the windows with delicate patterns each morning. The wheat was in the ground, growing stronger each day, promising a spring harvest if the winter wasn't too harsh. Katherine knew the time was approaching when Ethan would continue his journey northward, and the thought created a hollow feeling in her chest that she tried desperately to ignore. One evening, as they sat by the fire shelling the last of the season's peas, Katherine gathered her courage. "Winter's coming," she observed, keeping her eyes on her work. Ethan agreed, his skilled fingers moving methodically through the task. "The railroad in Omaha will be hiring soon, I expect." She tried to keep her voice neutral. Ethan's hands stilled momentarily. "Likely so." "You've done more than enough here, Ethan. The crop's in, the roof's fixed. I can manage now." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. Ethan set aside his bowl of peas and looked at her directly. "Are you asking me to leave, Kate?" Katherine's heart hammered in her chest. "I'm saying you're free to go. You've fulfilled your promise. And if I don't want to go," his voice was quiet, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Why would you stay?" she whispered. Ethan moved closer, his calloused hand gently covering hers. "Because in all my years of wandering, I've never found a place that felt right. Until now." Katherine stared at their joined hands, emotions warring within her grief for James, guilt at the feelings Ethan stirred in her, and a desperate longing for something she couldn't name. "I'm not asking for promises, Kate," Ethan continued when she remained silent. "Just time to see if whatever's growing between us is worth nurturing." "I don't know if I can," she admitted, finally meeting his eyes. "James hasn't been gone but 4 months. I still wear his ring." She twisted the simple gold band on her finger. "It feels like betrayal." Ethan nodded, his expression somber. "I understand." He withdrew his hand slowly. "I'll leave in the morning." "No," the force of her response surprised them both. Katherine took a deep breath, steadying herself. "No," she repeated more calmly. "Stay through the winter. The farm will need tending and traveling in the snow is dangerous." She hesitated. "I'm not promising anything, Ethan, but I'm not ready to say goodbye either." A smile, rare and genuine, transformed his face. "That's enough for now, Kate." That's enough. The first snow came in November, blanketing the prairie in pristine white. Ethan moved from the barn into the house at Katherine's insistence. The temperature had dropped too low for anyone to safely sleep in the uninsulated structure. He made a pallet before the fireplace, maintaining a respectful distance that both frustrated and relieved Katherine. The long winter evenings were filled with conversation as they came to know each other in ways that summer's urgent work had prevented. Katherine learned that Ethan had fought for the Confederacy, not out of belief in the cause, but because Texas was home. He spoke of the guilt he carried for actions taken in war, of the brother he'd lost at Gettysburg, of his failed attempts to rebuild afterward. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of meeting James at a church social when she was 18, of their dreams that had withered in the harsh reality of frontier life. "Did you love him very much?" Ethan asked one night as they sat before the fire, Katherine mending a shirt while he whittled a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. The question didn't surprise her as it might have months earlier. They had reached a place of honesty that made such directness possible. "Yes," she said simply. "He was kind and full of dreams. He made me believe anything was possible." She set her mending aside. But it wasn't the grand passion you read about in novels. It was quieter than that, comfortable. Ethan nodded, his knife pausing in its work. "And now, do you still love him?" Katherine considered the question carefully. "I'll always love the memory of him, but the pain isn't as sharp as it was." She looked at Ethan directly. "He wouldn't have wanted me to be alone forever. James wasn't selfish that way." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, hope, perhaps, or understanding. He returned to his carving and Katherine to her mending, but the silence between them had changed, filled with unspoken possibilities. December brought Christmas, the first Katherine had faced without family. She found herself unexpectedly emotional as she unpacked the few decorations she and James had brought from Pennsylvania, a star for the top of a tree, a porcelain angel that had belonged to her mother, red ribbons to tie around candles. Ethan noticed her melancholy and disappeared for several hours, returning with a small pine tree strapped to his back and snow melting in his hair. Together they decorated the humble tree, and on Christmas morning, Katherine woke to find a beautifully carved wooden box beside her bed. "Ethan," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate prairie flowers he had carved into the lid. "It's beautiful." "Open it," he urged, an unusual nervousness in his manner. Inside lay a delicate silver chain with a single pearl pendant. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Only thing of value I've managed to hang onto all these years." Katherine stared at the necklace, understanding the significance of such a gift. "I can't accept this," she protested. "It's your family heirloom." Ethan gently took the necklace from the box and held it up. "I've carried it across half the country, waiting for the right person to give it to." His eyes met hers. "I'd be honored if you'd wear it, Kate." With trembling hands, Katherine turned and lifted her hair. Ethan fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers lingering for a moment against her skin. When she turned back to him, his expression made her heart race. "I haven't got anything for you," she admitted, touching the pearl that now rested at the hollow of her throat. "You've given me a home," he said simply. "That's more than I ever expected to find again." Before she could respond, Ethan leaned forward and kissed her tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. His hands cradled her face as if she were something precious, and Katherine felt the last barriers around her heart begin to crumble. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Katherine rested her forehead against his. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Of what?" "Of feeling this much." "Of losing it again." She closed her eyes. "Life out here is so uncertain, Ethan. People leave, they die, they change their minds." Ethan's thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "I can't promise we won't face hardship, Kate. That would be a lie, but I can promise I won't walk away, not by choice." She searched his eyes, finding only sincerity. Slowly, deliberately, Katherine removed the gold band from her finger, the last physical connection to James and the life they'd shared. She placed it carefully in the wooden box Ethan had made. "A new beginning," she whispered, and kissed him again. January brought a blizzard that isolated them completely for nearly 2 weeks. They survived on stored provisions and each other's company, the forced intimacy accelerating the deepening of their relationship. Katherine discovered Ethan had a talent for storytelling, spinning tales of his travels that made her laugh until her sides ached. In turn, he delighted in her singing voice as she taught him songs from her childhood. At night, they slept separately, still Ethan on his pallet before the fire, Katherine in her bed across the room, but the tension between them grew with each passing day. Katherine found herself watching the way his hands moved as he repaired her father's old fiddle, imagining those same hands on her body. She caught him looking at her sometimes with such naked longing that it made her blush to her roots. The blizzard finally broke in late January, allowing Ethan to check on the livestock and assess damage to the outbuildings. Katherine stood in the doorway watching him wade through snowdrifts, struck by how completely he had integrated himself into her life and heart in just a few short months. That evening, as they sat before the fire sharing a cup of coffee, Katherine made her decision. Setting aside her cup, she rose and crossed to where Ethan sat, taking his face in her hands. I don't want to wait anymore, she said simply, and kissed him with all the longing she'd been suppressing. Ethan responded immediately, pulling her into his lap as the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, his eyes were dark with desire. Are you certain, Kate? I don't want you to have regrets. In answer, Katherine stood and held out her hand. Come to bed, Ethan, please. He followed her across the room, his expression a mixture of awe and reverence that made her feel both powerful and vulnerable. As they undressed each other slowly, learning the contours of bodies they had only imagined, Katherine felt the last vestiges of her grief give way to a new emotion, joy, pure and uncomplicated. Their lovemaking was tender at first, then increasingly passionate as they discovered each other's desires. Afterward, lying in each other's arms as the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, Katherine felt a contentment she hadn't believed possible again. I love you, Ethan murmured against her hair. Have for a while now. Katherine raised herself on an elbow to look at him. When did you know? He smiled, tracing the curve of her shoulder. That first day when I saw you crying in the field, you looked so fierce even in your despair. Like you'd fight the whole world if you had to. His eyes grew serious. But you shouldn't have to fight alone, Kate. No one should. Katherine blinked back sudden tears. I love you too, she whispered, and I'm not afraid anymore. February brought warmer days, melting snow revealing the winter wheat sprouting green and promising beneath. As they inspected the fields together, hands linked, Ethan broached the subject that had been on both their minds. Spring will be here soon, he observed. We should talk about what happens next. Katherine squeezed his hand. What do you want to happen? Ethan turned to face her, his expression earnest. I want to marry you, Kate. Make this official. He gestured to the farmhouse and fields beyond. Build a life here if that's what you want. Or somewhere else if you'd prefer. Here, she said without hesitation. This is home now for both of us. She smiled up at him. And yes, I'll marry you, Ethan Quinn, the sooner the better. The wedding took place in early March, a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who stopped at the farm on his monthly rounds. Their only guests were neighbors from miles around who had come to know Ethan through his willingness to lend a hand whenever needed during the winter months. Katherine wore her best dress and the pearl necklace Ethan had given her for Christmas. Ethan had traded a handmade rocking chair for a proper suit, looking so handsome it made Katherine's breath catch when she first saw him waiting for her by the fireplace they had shared through the long winter nights. As they exchanged vows, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, the grief that had seemed insurmountable, the desperate plea in a barren field, and the answer that had come in the form of a man who understood that sometimes strength meant asking for help. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher declared, and their assembled neighbors cheered as Ethan kissed his bride. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food contributed by every family and music provided by those who could play. Katherine found herself watching Ethan as he spoke easily with their neighbors, accepted congratulations, and occasionally sought her eyes across the room, his expression soft with love. You've done well for yourself, Martha Jenkins, their nearest neighbor at 3 miles distant, commented as she sat beside Katherine. That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. Katherine smiled, her hand automatically going to the pearl at her throat. It wasn't what I expected, starting over like this, but sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as its greatest challenges. Wise words, Martha agreed, and practical too. A woman alone out here, she shook her head. It's not just about having a man around, though that helps. It's about having the right partner, someone who sees you as an equal. Katherine's eyes found Ethan again, now teaching a group of children a clapping game he claimed to have learned in New Orleans. Yes, she said softly, that's exactly it. Later that night, after their guests had departed and they were finally alone as husband and wife, Ethan carried Katherine across the threshold of what was now truly their home. They made love slowly, reverently, sealing their vows in the most ancient way. Afterward, as moonlight spilled through the window, Ethan traced patterns on Katherine's bare shoulder. Happy, he asked. Completely, she assured him, nestling closer. Though I was thinking about something Martha said tonight about partners and equals. Oh. Ethan's hand continued its gentle exploration. When you found me that day, I was so desperate to prove I could manage alone, as if accepting help somehow made me weak. She propped herself up to look at him. But real strength is knowing when you can't do something alone, isn't it? Ethan considered this. I think so. Took me years of wandering to figure that out myself. He kissed her forehead. We're stronger together, Kate, always will be. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The winter wheat flourished under their combined care, and Katherine planted a vegetable garden twice the size of previous years. Ethan constructed a proper irrigation system that reduced their dependence on unpredictable rainfall, and together they repaired fences, expanded the chicken coop, and added a small herd of cattle to diversify their farm. In late April, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Katherine took Ethan's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. We're going to need a bigger house, she said simply. Ethan's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as he understood her meaning. A baby, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine nodded, her eyes shining. Due in November, just before the first snow, if my calculations are correct. Ethan pulled her into his arms, his joy too great for words. They sat entwined as darkness fell, planning their future and the family they would build together on land that had once seemed impossible to tame alone. Summer brought abundant rain, promising a bountiful harvest. Katherine's body changed as the baby grew within her, and Ethan watched in fascination and reverence as she blossomed. He took on more of the physical labor, insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day, though Katherine was determined to continue contributing to their shared venture. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she would remind him when his protectiveness became too stifling. Humor me, he would reply with a smile that still made her heart race. It's my first time at this. Their evenings were spent preparing for the baby Ethan, crafting a cradle from wood he'd hauled from the riverbed 20 miles away. Katherine sewing tiny garments from fabric she traded eggs and butter to obtain. They spoke of names, of dreams for their child's future, of the legacy they were building together. In late August, as they harvested the wheat that would secure their financial stability for the coming year, Katherine paused in her work, one hand pressed to her back, the other cradling her swollen belly. What is it? Ethan asked immediately, noticing her discomfort. Nothing, she assured him with a smile, just felt the baby move, here. She took his hand and placed it where their child kicked vigorously. Ethan's expression of wonder never diminished no matter how many times he felt the movement. Strong, he observed. Like its mother, Katherine laughed. And stubborn like its father, Ethan grinned, unrepentant. Good combination, this child will be able to face whatever life brings. Yes, Katherine agreed, looking out over their thriving farm, the golden wheat ready for harvest, the vegetable garden bursting with produce, the small herd of cattle grazing contentedly in the distance. Because they'll know they don't have to face it alone. Autumn painted the prairie in russet and gold as they completed the harvest, stored provisions for winter, and made final preparations for the baby's arrival. Katherine had arranged for Martha Jenkins to attend the birth, the older woman having assisted with dozens of deliveries over her years on the frontier. Everything looks just as it should, Martha assured Katherine during her last visit before the birth. That baby's positioned perfectly. Should be an easy delivery. Ethan, overhearing as he entered with firewood, looked unconvinced. Nothing about bringing a new life into the world seems easy to me, he commented, stacking the logs by the fireplace. Martha laughed. Listen to the man. Been delivering babies longer than you've been shaving, Mr. Quinn, and I know what I'm talking about. She patted Katherine's hand. First babies sometimes take their time, but you're strong and healthy. You'll do fine. November arrived with unseasonably mild weather, as if nature itself was cooperating with their plans. Katherine woke one morning to a strange sensation, a tightening across her abdomen that came and went like waves. Ethan, she said calmly, touching his shoulder as he slept beside her. I think it's time to fetch Martha. He was instantly alert, pulling on clothes and boots with remarkable speed for a man awakened from deep sleep. Are you certain? It's not too early, Katherine smiled at his nervousness. The baby will come when it's ready. But yes, I'm certain these are proper contractions, not just practice ones. Ethan hesitated by the bedside, clearly torn between staying with her and fetching the help they needed. I'll be back as quick as I can, he promised, kissing her forehead. An hour, no more. We'll be fine, she assured him, rubbing her belly as another contraction began to build. This little one and I understand each other. The hours that followed tested Katherine's resolve as the contractions intensified, but Martha's steady presence and Ethan's unwavering support gave her the strength to endure. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor of their home, Katherine gave a final push, and their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Ethan's eyes. A girl, Martha announced, cleaning and wrapping the infant before placing her in Katherine's waiting arms. A beautiful, healthy girl. Katherine looked down at their daughter, 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, a dusting of dark hair like Ethan's, and eyes that would likely turn the same shade of green as her own. Elizabeth, she whispered, recalling the name they had chosen if the baby was a girl. Elizabeth Quinn. Ethan sat beside them on the bed, his finger gently tracing the curve of his daughter's cheek. She's perfect, he said, his voice thick with emotion, just like her mother. Would you like to hold her? Katherine asked, sensing his desire and uncertainty. With infinite care, Ethan took the tiny bundle, cradling Elizabeth as if she were made of the finest porcelain. Hello, little one, he murmured. I'm your pa. Martha, having cleaned up and ensured Katherine was comfortable, smiled at the tableau before her. I'll be back to check on you tomorrow, she said, gathering her things. Rest while the baby sleeps, Katherine. You've done good work today. After Martha's departure, the new family settled into a peaceful quiet, broken only by Elizabeth's occasional soft sounds as she slept in the cradle Ethan had crafted with such love. Thank you, Ethan said suddenly, looking at Katherine with such profound gratitude it made her throat tighten. For what? For this. He gestured to encompass their home, their daughter, the life they had built together, for letting me stay that first day, for trusting me with your heart. Katherine reached for his hand, twining their fingers together. And thank you for showing me I didn't have to do it all alone. That accepting help isn't weakness but wisdom. The first snow of winter began to fall outside their window, gentle flakes that would blanket their farm in pristine white by morning. Inside, warmed by fire and love, the Quinn family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. 5 years passed, bringing both joy and hardship to the Quinn family. Their farm prospered despite occasional drought and the ever-present challenges of frontier life. Elizabeth grew from a determined infant into a spirited child with her father's quiet strength and her mother's fierce independence. In the spring of 1883, Katherine gave birth to their son, James Ethan Quinn, named in honor of her first husband and the man who had saved her in every way that mattered. The boy had his father's eyes and his mother's auburn hair, a combination that charmed everyone who met him. By the summer of 1885, their homestead had expanded to include a proper barn, a second bedroom added to the original house, and fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The railroad had established a small depot 5 miles from their farm, bringing increased opportunity for trade and connection to the wider world. On a warm June evening, as they sat on the porch watching 7-year-old Elizabeth chase fireflies while 2-year-old James dozed in Katherine's lap, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. "When I first found you in the field," Katherine smiled, her hand automatically going to the pearl pendant she still wore daily. "Often. I was so broken then, so certain I'd failed. And now," Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders. Katherine looked out at their thriving farm, their beautiful children, and the man who had become the center of her world. "Now I know that sometimes our greatest failures lead to our greatest blessings. If I hadn't reached the end of my rope that day, you might have ridden right past." Ethan kissed her temple, his love for her as strong as it had been that first winter they spent learning each other's hearts. "I like to think I'd have stopped anyway," Some things are just meant to be. Elizabeth ran up to them, her hands cupped around a glowing firefly. Look, Pa. I caught the biggest one. Ethan lifted his daughter onto his lap, examining her prize with exaggerated awe. That's surely the king of all fireflies, Lizzie. Better let him go so he can find his family. The little girl nodded solemnly and opened her hands, watching as the insect took flight, its light pulsing as it rose into the darkening sky. Will he find them, Pa? I believe he will, Ethan assured her. Everyone deserves to find their way home. Later that night, after the children were asleep, and the house was quiet save for the gentle creaking of the floors, Katherine and Ethan lay together, their bodies still fitting perfectly after all these years. I've been thinking, Katherine said, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. A dangerous pastime, Ethan teased, earning a playful swat. I'm serious, she continued. Martha Jenkins is getting too old to manage her place alone since her Arthur passed. I was thinking we could offer her the room we added for when your sister visits. Ethan considered this. It's a good idea. She was there for us when we needed her most. Seems only right to return the favor. That's what I thought. Katherine propped herself up on an elbow to look at him. And the children adore her. She's like the grandmother they never had. Ethan tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, marveling at how she could still make his heart race with just a look. You've got the kindest heart of anyone I've ever known, Kate Quinn. One of the many reasons I love you. And you, she replied, kissing him softly, are the answer to a prayer I didn't even know how to ask. She settled back against him, contentment washing over her like a warm tide. We've built something beautiful here, haven't we? We have, Ethan agreed, his arms tightening around her. Together, outside their window, the vast Nebraska prairie stretched under a canopy of stars, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning 7 years earlier. The land that had once seemed so impossible to tame alone now flourished under their combined care. A testament to the truth Katherine had learned that desperate day in the fields that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in standing alone, but in reaching for another's hand. As they drifted toward sleep, Katherine thought of the young woman she had been, weeping with despair as she fought a battle she couldn't win alone. And she thought of the man who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer, taking up the plow and offering not just his strength but his heart. Now we can, he had said, and together they had.